What would you do if you spent your whole life building fairy tales for other women, and then one night, standing in a ballroom you had made beautiful for somebody else, you laughed bitterly and told the most dangerous man alive that nobody would ever marry a fat girl like you? And instead of walking away, he looked you dead in the eyes and said, "Then let's prove them all wrong." She had said it as a joke. The kind of joke you make so that you can be the one who says it first, before somebody else does. And the most feared man in the city did not laugh. He set down his glass, and he crossed the space between them, and he made her an offer that detonated everything the world believed about her. This is a story of cruelty and hidden worth, of a woman who built happiness for everyone but herself, and of the ruthless man who decided the whole city had been blind. Sadie Quinn was the best wedding planner in the city, and she had never once been asked to dance at any of them. She was 32, soft and generously curved, with a round face and a warm laugh and a habit of apologizing to doorframes she bumped into. For 9 years, she had built other women's happiest days, and she was extraordinary at it, because Sadie Quinn had a mind that worked like nothing else in her industry. She remembered everything. Every vendor, every florist's van, every waiter's name, every seating chart she had ever drawn, every guest's allergy and grudge and old affair. She could walk into a room of 400 strangers and tell you who had arrived late, who had switched place cards, and who did not belong. Her clients called it a gift and used it and never once asked how it worked. What nobody saw was the ache underneath. Sadie had grown up in a family that measured a daughter in dress sizes, with a mother who sighed at photographs and an aunt who asked, every single Christmas, whether Sadie had considered that men simply did not choose girls like her. She had been engaged once, at 24, to a man who left her 3 weeks before the wedding she had planned herself, and who told her, on his way out the door, that he had finally admitted to himself he could not picture walking her down an aisle. She had already chosen the flowers. She had already written her vows. She had sat alone on the floor of her apartment surrounded by fabric swatches for her own reception and canceled every single vendor herself, one polite phone call at a time, apologizing to each of them as though the humiliation had been a scheduling error. She never told anyone that. She simply went to work the following Monday and built somebody else's aisle instead, and then another, and another, for 9 years, smiling from the edges of 1,000 photographs she was never in. She stopped dating. She stopped hoping. She got very, very good at being the woman who made the magic and went home alone. And on the night everything changed, she was standing at the back of the grandest ballroom she had ever designed, watching another woman get everything, with no idea that across that room a man carved from stillness and menace had been watching her all evening. The wedding was the social event of the year, and Sadie had built it out of nothing but nerve and 10,000 small decisions. 14,000 white roses, a string quartet, a cathedral of candlelight and marble, and the bride, Priscilla Vane, a razor-thin socialite who had made Sadie's life a misery for 8 months, glittered through it like she had grown it herself. It was near midnight when Priscilla found her by the service door, 3 glasses of champagne into her own reception, with an audience of bridesmaids trailing behind. "Sadie," she cooed, loud enough to turn heads. "Come here, you did such a job." She looked Sadie up and down with theatrical pity. "God, look at you. Do you ever get sad doing this?" She turned to her friends, delighted. "She's been planning weddings for 9 years, and she's never had one." 9 years. Isn't that the saddest thing you've ever heard? A ripple of laughter. Sadie stood there in her plain black work dress, holding a clipboard, her cheeks burning, 32 years of it rising in her throat, and she did the thing she always did. She smiled. "Of course not," she said. "Someone has to make it beautiful." And Priscilla, sensing blood, leaned in and delivered the blade with a wink. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Maybe one day." She drifted away in a cloud of silk, and Sadie stood very still until the ballroom blurred, and then she walked out onto the empty stone terrace, into the cold, and let go of one single tear. That was where he found her. She did not hear him come. She simply became aware, the way you become aware of weather, that the temperature of the whole terrace had dropped 20 degrees, and she turned and found a man standing in the doorway with a glass of amber whiskey in his hand. She knew his face. Everyone knew his face, the way they knew the face of something dangerous. Adriano Sarto was tall and broad and dressed in a charcoal suit cut with lethal precision, the head of a syndicate that owned the ports and the docks and the fear of every powerful family for 100 miles. He rarely raised his voice. Grown men sweated when he looked at them. Sadie scrubbed at her face and straightened. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Sarto," she said, sliding instantly back into the woman who apologized for existing. "The terrace isn't part of the reception. I can have it open for you. I'll just get out of your way." "Stay," he said. It was not a request. He came and stood at the balustrade beside her, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, and the silence was somehow worse than the mockery. "I heard what she said to you," he said finally. Sadie let out a laugh that came out wrong, cracked and bitter and far too honest, because it was midnight and she was empty and she had nothing left to guard. "She's not wrong," she said. "That's the funny part. 9 years, Mr. Sarto. I have made 400 women the most beautiful thing in the room, and not one man has ever once looked at me and thought about forever." And she turned to him, and she smiled, and she said the sentence she had been swallowing her entire life. "Nobody marries a fat girl." It hung there in the cold between them, ugly and true and finally spoken, and Sadie felt something in her chest give way at the relief of it, because she had carried that sentence for 32 years and never once let it out of her mouth. Adriano Sarto did not laugh. He did not offer her pity or a platitude or the soft, embarrassed noise people made when she said the quiet part out loud. He simply set his glass down on the balustrade and turned to face her fully and looked at her the way no one in her whole overlooked life had ever looked at her. "Then let's prove them all wrong," he said. Sadie stared at him. She had no idea he was entirely, terrifyingly serious. It was not a kindness. It was a proposal, and it was, Adriano explained in the cold on that terrace, also a transaction, which was the only reason Sadie's disbelief did not curdle into humiliation. He had a problem. The commission had grown restless with an unmarried boss. An unmarried man had no heirs, no anchor, and every rival family on the coast had begun circling with daughters and knives. A wedding would settle the question of succession, calm the families, and buy him a season of peace. He had been putting it off for 2 years because every woman offered to him came with a bloodline, an agenda, and a second set of eyes in his house. "Why me?" Sadie whispered. "Because I have watched you work for 8 months, Adriano said. Priscilla Vane hired the most dangerous men in this city into a room, and you moved 400 of us around like chess pieces, and not one person noticed you doing it. You know every face in that ballroom. You knew my cousin was seated wrong before he did. You are the only person I have ever met who sees a room the way I see one." Sadie's throat closed. "So it's a business arrangement," she said. He was quiet for a beat too long. "It is an offer," he said, "and it is also the first honest thing I have wanted in 10 years. Take it or refuse it, but do not stand there and tell me nobody marries you." He stepped closer, and the scent of him, cedar and tobacco, and something darker underneath, wrapped around her senses. "Somebody is standing in front of you asking." She should have said no. Instead, she thought about 9 years of other women's aisles, and a man at 24 who could not picture walking her down one, and a lifetime of being the woman who made the magic and went home. And Sadie Quinn, who had never once been chosen, lifted her chin and said yes. 6 weeks, Adriano said. "Plan it yourself. Spare nothing." She laughed, wetly, helplessly. "You want me to plan my own wedding?" "I want you," he said, "to build the most beautiful thing this city has ever seen, and then walk down the middle of it, and let every person who ever laughed at you watch." And she had no idea that in saying yes, she had just put herself in the crosshairs of a war. The next 6 weeks turned Sadie Quinn's world inside out. He moved her into the fortress above the water, and she braced for a cage and got, instead, the strangest thing of all, respect. Adriano did not touch her. He did not perform. He simply, methodically, dismantled every wall the world had built around her. He gave her a budget with no ceiling and a free hand. And when she caught herself apologizing for the cost of the flowers, he took the pen out of her hand and said, quietly, "You are not allowed to make yourself small in this house." And Sadie, who had spent 9 years building fairy tales for women who never thanked her, began, for the first time, to build one for herself. But it was the nights that undid her. He started finding excuses to be wherever she was. He would come home at 2 in the morning from something bloody and unspoken and find her at the kitchen table surrounded by seating charts. And he would pour 2 measures of amber whiskey and sit down across from her and just watch her work. He learned she hummed when she was thinking. He learned she flinched at raised voices and softened at kindness, and it made him want to burn her family to the ground. And Adriano Sarto, who trusted no one, found himself telling her things he had never told another living soul, about the father he had buried and the trust he had learned to bury with him. One night he asked her, carefully, about the man who left. Sadie told him. All of it. The 3 weeks. The aisle he could not picture. And Adriano was silent for so long that she looked up and found something in his face that frightened her, because it was not pity. Give me his name, he said. Absolutely not, she said. He held her eyes for a moment, and then, unbelievably, the corner of his mouth moved. Fine, he said. Then I will simply have to make him watch. And Sadie laughed, a real one, the first in 9 years, and Adriano Sarto looked at her like a man who had just heard music. Later, at her door, he paused, and his hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, and Sadie thought he might kiss her. Instead, he only looked at her, memorizing her, and murmured good night, and left her standing there with her heart pounding like a girl's, terrified of how much she had begun to want a man the whole world feared. She did not know that the engagement had already been read by one man in that house as a death sentence. The man reading it was Gideon, Adriano's underboss, the silver-tongued second who had served the family since Adriano was young. For 2 years Gideon had been quietly bleeding the ports, skimming through a maintenance shell, and for 2 years he had been waiting with the patience of a predator for the one thing that would hand him everything. An unmarried boss with no heirs and a commission losing faith. All he had needed was time. And then his boss had gone to a wedding and come home engaged to a fat wedding planner. A wife meant an anchor. An anchor meant heirs. Heirs meant Gideon would die a servant. He smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan. And the beauty of it, the elegance he could not stop admiring, was that Adriano had handed him the perfect room. A wedding. For 100 guests. 50 vendors. 200 hired staff moving through the house in uniforms nobody would look at twice. He would not need an army. He would need a guest list. The soft, overlooked bride, he was certain, would never notice a thing. It was the last mistake he would make as a free man. Cruelty, of course, could not leave it alone. 3 weeks before the wedding, Adriano took Sadie to a commissioned dinner and seated her at his right hand, in a gown of deep emerald that celebrated every curve she had spent 32 years apologizing for. And halfway through the evening Priscilla Vane arrived on her new husband's arm and saw her. She crossed the room like a blade. Sadie, she said, loud and delighted. My little planner. And she turned to the table of lethal men with a laugh. Everyone, you have to know, this woman has spent 9 years planning other people's weddings because nobody would ever give her one. Her eyes glittered. Mr. Sarto, whatever she's told you, be careful. Fat girls get desperate. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Adriano did not raise his voice. He finished cutting his food, chewed, swallowed, and took an agonizingly long moment before lifting his gaze. I don't recall inviting you to my table, he said. Priscilla's smile flickered. Adriano set down his fork, and the soft clink of silver on porcelain sounded like a gunshot. Let me clarify something for you, he said, his tone deadly calm. 8 months ago, you paid this woman to build you the most beautiful night of your life, and she did, and you thanked her by mocking her in front of your friends at her own achievement. He rose slowly, and the entire room seemed to shrink. You possessed nothing of value. No intellect. No loyalty. No use. Everything anyone has ever admired about you, she built. His dead eyes did not blink. In 3 weeks, she walks down an aisle in this city, and you will read about it, and you will spend the rest of your small life knowing that the woman you laughed at was chosen by me, and that no one has ever, once, chosen you for anything but your father's money. Now walk away from my table. Priscilla fled. Adriano sat back down, took Sadie's trembling hand, and pressed his lips to her knuckles in front of every capo in the city. You never shrink for anyone again, Spasa, he murmured, using the word for the first time. Bride, not in my world, and never in front of me. But across the room, Gideon watched the way his boss looked at her, and understood that his window had just closed to weeks. The wedding, he decided, would be the funeral. Sadie found it 11 days out, and she found it the way she found everything, which was by remembering. She was at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with the vendor roster spread in front of her, cross-checking the final staffing manifests, and something in the third column snagged in her mind like a thread on a nail. A catering company. Belrose Catering, 42 servers. She had used Belrose Catering for 9 years. And Belrose Catering had 31 employees. She sat very still. Then she pulled the florist manifest and found a van registration that did not match the plate she had been staring at for a decade. Then the valet roster. Then the security rotation. And one by one, across 4 different vendors, Sadie Quinn found 11 names that did not exist, 11 uniforms that would walk through the perimeter on the day of her wedding with clearance she had personally signed. She did not scream. She did not run to Adriano in a panic. She thought, cold and clear. Because a name on a manifest needs a signature, and every one of those additions had been approved by someone with authority above hers, someone with the boss's own clearance code, someone close enough to the center of that house to sign in Adriano's shadow. She followed the code, and when it resolved, her blood went to ice. Gideon. She sat alone in that kitchen as the dawn came up gray in the tall windows, staring at a name she had watched pour her fiancé a drink 2 nights earlier, and understood that the man who had embraced Adriano at their engagement dinner intended to have him shot in front of 400 witnesses. Someone was going to kill Adriano at his own wedding, in front of 400 people, using the guest list she had built. She spent 6 days doing the most dangerous work of her life. She could not simply cancel. Cancellation would spook the traitor and lose them the chance to take him alive. So Sadie did what Sadie did. She rebuilt the room. Quietly, without changing a single visible thing, she redrew the entire architecture of her own wedding. She moved the 11 false staff onto stations she controlled. She rewrote the seating chart so that every one of Adriano's loyal men sat inside the kill zone. She changed the service corridors so that the only path from the fake caterers to the altar ran through a marble gallery with exactly 1 exit. And she told Adriano everything. He went so still and so cold when she laid it out that she thought, for one terrible second, that he did not believe her. Then he looked up at her, and his eyes were burning. "You found a war," he said quietly, in a spreadsheet. On the morning of the wedding, Sadie Quinn stood in front of a mirror in a gown she had designed herself. Ivory silk cut to celebrate every soft, generous inch of the body she had spent her whole life apologizing for, and she did not shrink. She looked magnificent, and she knew it, and beneath the layered skirt, strapped to her thigh where 9 years of experience told her no man would ever think to check a fat bride, was a small radio transmitter keyed to Vito, Adriano's loyal lieutenant, and every armed man in that house. She had planned 400 weddings. She had never planned a trap. But it turned out they were, in the end, exactly the same job. The doors opened, and Sadie Quinn, who had been told nobody would ever marry a fat girl, walked down the center of the most beautiful aisle that city had ever seen, in front of 400 people, straight toward the most dangerous man alive. She did not scurry. She did not shrink. She did not apologize to a single square foot of the room she had built, and 400 faces turned. And for the first time in 9 years, Sadie Quinn was not at the edge of the photograph. She was the photograph. Time seemed to fracture. She saw everything at once, the way she always had. She saw the false caterer at the North Station shift his weight. She saw the florist's man reach for a jacket that had no reason to be buttoned. She saw Gideon at the front, smiling with tears in his eyes, playing the loyal brother, and she saw the exact moment his hand moved toward the inside of his coat. Sadie reached the altar. She put her hand in Adriano's, and she felt it close around hers, warm and steady and absolutely certain. And she leaned in, as though for a whispered word of love, and said, for seconds. Adriano's mouth curved. Then Sadie squeezed the transmitter in her palm. The lights in the ballroom died. Every single one, all at once, on a system she had spent 9 years learning to control, plunging 400 people into total darkness. And in the 2 seconds before the emergency floods came up, the 11 false staff lost every advantage they had. Gunfire cracked. Screams. And when the light returned, hard and white and merciless, the entire architecture of the room had inverted. Every fake caterer stood inside a ring of Vito's men. Every path out was sealed by a wall Sadie had drawn on a floor plan 6 days earlier. And Gideon stood alone at the altar with his weapon half drawn and nowhere on earth to go. It was not a fight so much as an ending. He turned it on Sadie, because a cornered man always reaches for the softest thing in the room, and that was the last mistake he made. Adriano moved. He put himself between the muzzle and his bride before the sound had finished leaving the barrel, and the shot tore a line across his shoulder as he took the man down onto the marble, and Vito's men had Gideon pinned before the echo died. But Sadie was already on her knees in her ivory gown, her hands pressed hard against her fiancé's shoulder, her voice steady and commanding over the chaos. "You are all right," she was saying. "You are all right. It went through the meat, brief." And Adriano, bleeding on the floor of his own wedding, reached up with his good hand and framed her face. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking, his blood on her silk. "Look at me. Did they touch you?" Sadie let out a sob that was half a laugh. "You have been shot," she said, "and you are asking me." "Then answer me, Spasa," he growled. "I am perfectly fine," she wept. "I built this room. Nobody was ever getting to me in it." He stared up at her, at the woman 400 people had watched walk down an aisle, at the mind that had found a war in a vendor list and turned his wedding into a trap, and something in the most feared man in the city broke open completely. "I did not say it to save you," he said hoarsely. "On the terrace, I have let you believe for 6 weeks that it was a transaction because I am a coward about exactly one thing." He pulled her down, his forehead against hers. "I said it because I had been watching you for 8 months, and I could not breathe properly in rooms you were not in. Marry me for real, Sadie. Not for the commission. Not for peace. Because I am in love with you. And I have been since long before you ever said that ugly sentence on that terrace." Gideon, the man who had smiled at Adriano for 15 years while planning his funeral, learned the price of underestimating them before the week was out. Adriano did not act in blind rage. He let Sadie lay the entire elegant crime before the commission, every false name, every forged clearance, every dollar Gideon had skimmed through the ports for 2 years, all of it reconstructed from manifests a fat wedding planner had memorized. And when she finished, she looked at her champion and did not counsel death. "You do not need to make him a martyr," she said quietly. "You need to make him nothing." So they did it her way. They stripped Gideon of every hidden asset, exposed his treason to the very families he had hoped to rule, and let them cast him out. He was left alive, bankrupt, disgraced, his name turned into a warning whispered across the underworld, a fate the old men agreed was far crueler than any quick and merciful bullet. And Priscilla Vane, who had laughed that nobody would ever give Sadie a wedding, opened the newspaper 11 days later to a photograph of the most beautiful ceremony the city had ever seen, and had to live, for the rest of her life, in a world where the only truly enviable thing she had ever possessed had been designed by the woman she mocked. Sadie never said a word to her. She simply, finally, stopped taking her calls. 9 months later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Sadie Sarto stood on the terrace of the fortress with a cup of coffee, running an events company Adriano had put entirely in her name. The most sought-after firm on the coast now, because every powerful family in the city had learned that Sadie Sarto could see a room the way no one else alive could. She did not hide anymore. She wore rich color tailored to celebrate every curve, and she moved through the world not from the edges of the photographs, but from the center of them. Adriano came out, his shoulder long healed, and stopped simply to watch her the way he had that first night on the terrace. "You're staring, Mr. Sarto," she said, a smile in her voice. "I will never stop staring at you," he said, crossing to her, taking the cup gently from her hands and setting it down. He drew her in, his hands finding her waist, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You stood on a terrace and told me nobody marries a fat girl," he said. "Do you know what actually happened, Spasa? You built the most beautiful wedding this city has ever seen, walked down the middle of it, and caught the man who wanted me dead using a catering list." He tilted her chin up. "For 100 people came to watch you get married and left understanding they had been in the presence of the most formidable woman on this coast. Nobody marries a fat girl." He shook his head slowly. "No, my love. Nobody deserved you, and I got you anyway, and I will spend the rest of my life proving I was worth the isle." Sadie looked up at the man the whole city feared, a man who bowed to no one and yet bowed, entirely, to her, and for the first time in her life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent 9 years making other women's fairy tales while the world told her she would never be in one, and she had proven every last one of them wrong, because she alone had ever offered a ruthless man something real. She had said nobody marries a fat girl, and the most dangerous man alive had looked her in the eyes and said, let's prove them all wrong. And then he had built her an aisle, and she had walked down it, and the whole city had watched every step. If Sadie and Adriano's story of cruelty, hidden worth, and hard-won vindication moved you, if you cheered when the woman who built everyone else's happiness finally walked down an aisle of her own and outsmarted an entire syndicate on the way, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that the person the world says nobody chooses is so often the one worth choosing above all. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment in Sadie and Adriano's story?